Everyone in the office knew her name, but no one bothered to pronounce it correctly. It was Emily, or simply the girl from the file, said with that slightly bored tone of someone ordering coffee. She was 32 years old, her hair tied back with a stationary elastic, and her desk was against the back wall, the furthest from the window, the closest to the emergency exit, as if the physical space itself knew that no one expected much from her. She didn't complain. She organized, typed, sent, filed. She arrived at 8 and left at 6:30. And every morning, as she walked through the glass corridors of Fortuna Capital, she saw her own reflection in the glass and chose not to look to the sides. On that Thursday afternoon in August, when the central air conditioning at the New York headquarters was malfunctioning and the executives on the 12th floor were gathered around a mahogany table that cost more than her annual salary, CEO Zach Armstrong. He received news that made his eyes water. The company's main contract, a $100 million merger agreement with a European group, had a clause that no one had read carefully. A clause that, if activated, would render the agreement null and void. The meeting turned into an immediate storm. Overlapping voices, loosened ties, laptops turned everywhere. No one had the answer, and the senior lawyer who should have had the answer was on a transatlantic flight with no internet connection. Emily Wilson. She heard all of this because the meeting room was next to the printer that only she knew how to fix without calling IT. She was standing with her back to the camera, hands on the printer cover, paper jammed between the rollers, when she heard the contract name. Not the contract number, the name. And something inside her lit up with the silent precision of someone who had spent the last 8 months indexing every version of that document in a folder that absolutely no one had asked her to create. She finished unjamming the paper, folded the sheet, took a deep breath, and then knocked on the meeting room door. Emily had joined that company 8 years earlier with a resume that no one asked to see twice. She didn't have an MBA. She didn't have a postgraduate degree in finance, nor a last name that would open doors at business dinners. She had graduated from law school in upstate New York, passed the bar exam on her second attempt, and for reasons she rarely explained to anyone, had never practiced law. When asked, she would simply say that life had taken a different turn. What she didn't say was that her mother had fallen ill the same month she was supposed to pass the bar exam, and that the administrative job at Fortuna had been the only one that fit within the caregiving routine that no one else was willing to share with her. The years went by with the cruel logic of corporate environments that confuse invisibility with incompetence. Emily organized contracts she understood better than those who signed them. She read clauses while waiting for the printer to warm up. She created control spreadsheets that no one asked for and that everyone used without knowing where they came from. Once, a manager named Bobby Marshall presented at a board meeting an entire document management system she had put together, with his name on the cover and a generic thank you to the support team at the bottom. She said nothing. She kept it. Zach Armstrong, the CEO, was the kind of executive you'd find in every large European company. Smart enough to reach the top, arrogant enough to think he'd gotten there on his own. He wore tailored suits and had a habit of finishing other people's sentences before they were finished, as if each person's time in the room was less valuable than his own. To him, Emily wasn't an employee. She was a function. Something between the printer and the coffee maker. When he saw her standing in the doorway of the meeting room that afternoon, folded paper in hand and slightly dusty glasses, he frowned with the expression of someone about to ask someone to lock the door from the outside. But there was another person in that room, Dr. Megan Campbell, the interim general counsel, who was covering for the lead attorney and who, unlike the others, knew Emily for a specific reason. 3 months earlier, Emily had placed on her desk, unsolicited, a comparative summary of 2 versions of the same contract with a handwritten note saying, Clause 14, 3 changed between versions and no one updated the appendix. Megan had read it, filed it away, and forgotten about it, as we forget everything that we can't fit into our immediate worldview. Now, with chaos reigning in the room, she was the one who didn't stop the door from closing. Emily entered. The room's temperature was different from the hallways, colder, heavier. 8 pairs of eyes turned to her, each with distinct variations of the same expression: surprise, impatience, condescension. Zach Armstrong opened his mouth. She spoke first. She said only one sentence, in the calm voice of someone who had rehearsed without realizing they were rehearsing. And in that sentence was a version number, a clause number, and the exact name of the point of conflict that had jeopardized the contract. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of someone who didn't understand. It was the silence of someone who understood all too well. Armstrong recovered quickly. He was the kind of man who never let discomfort linger for more than 3 seconds. He asked her to explain further, in a tone that wasn't curiosity, it was testing. Emily placed the folded paper on the table, unfolded it, and it was a printout of Clause 14. 3 from the original version of the contract, alongside a handwritten note cross-referencing it to the outdated appendix. She had printed it that afternoon while the paper jammed in the typewriter because she had read the contract number in the internal email that circulated among the assistants and recognized it immediately. No one in the room asked how she knew. No one was ready to ask that question yet. What followed was an intense hour inside that room, with Emily at the center of a dynamic she had never occupied before. She didn't gesture. She didn't raise her voice. She answered each question with surgical precision, referencing versions, dates, signatory names, contractual deadlines. Bobby Marshall, the same manager who had put his name on her work months before, twice tried to take control of the conversation, translating what she was saying as if she needed an interpreter to speak to the directors. The second time, Megan Campbell interrupted him with an objectivity that cut through the air. "Bobby," she was explaining, "let her finish." The problem was real and had a possible solution, but the solution depended on one thing that no one in the room had: the negotiation version of the contract, with the change history showing who had approved the change to the clause and when. This file wasn't on the main server. It wasn't in the project folder. It was, as Emily knew, on an external backup she herself had created during the system migration the previous year, when the IT department had discarded temporary files without verifying their contents. She had saved everything on an external hard drive. Inside the drawer of her desk at the back of the hallway, Armstrong sent her to get it, in that tone. The same tone as, "Can you bring more coffee?" And she went. There were more important things happening than the ego of a man who still hadn't understood what kind of situation he was in. As she walked down the hall back to her desk, 2 assistants looked at her with expressions that suggested they didn't know what was happening, but knew something had changed. She opened the drawer, took out the hard drive, and returned. It was only 4 minutes, but it felt like 20. The file was there, complete with timestamps, names, approval trail. And with it came an unexpected revelation. The problematic clause had been altered at the request of an internal party, not the European counterpart. The request had a name. The name was Bobby Marshall. He had requested the change via email without consulting legal counsel, and the change had gone unnoticed because the final version of the document had been generated by an intern who didn't know they needed to update the corresponding attachment. The contract was at risk because of an internal error, and the man who had made that error was sitting 2 meters away from Emily. The silence that filled the room when Megan Campbell read the email aloud was different from the previous silence. That one was one of astonishment. This one was one of gravity. Bobby stood still. The color drained from his face in a way Emily had never seen happen so quickly in a human being. He tried to say it had been a misunderstanding, that the context was different, that he had communicated with someone. Each sentence that came out of his mouth dug deeper. Armstrong didn't look at him. He looked at Emily. And for the first time that afternoon, there was something different in his gaze. It wasn't gratitude yet. It was an involuntary recognition. The meeting was suspended for 40 minutes so Megan and Emily could work together on drafting a response document for the European group, arguing that the clause had been inserted due to an operational error and requesting a correction window before the closing date. It was a delicate legal move. Emily drafted the core of the argument. Megan adjusted the tone and signed it. As they worked, side by side in the empty meeting room, Megan said softly, without taking her eyes off the screen, "You should have been on the other side of this table a long time ago." Emily didn't reply, but her fingers paused for a second before continuing to type. The email was sent at 8 o'clock in the evening. The European office would only respond the following morning, which meant there was a whole night of uncertainty ahead. While the directors went out in groups to call lawyers, partners, people with the power to contain the damage, Emily sat in the chair she had occupied during that meeting, the same leather chair that cost more than the computer on her desk at the back of the hall. She looked out the window at the city below, with the lights of New York beginning to appear in the approaching darkness. She didn't yet know what that night would change, but she knew that, after that day, the desk against the back wall no longer fit inside her. The American group's response arrived at 8 o'clock the following morning in an email sent directly to Zach Armstrong with a copy to the founding partners of Fortuna Capital. They accepted the correction window, but set a condition. They wanted a video call that same afternoon with the legal expert who had identified the problem and constructed the response. They wanted to understand who they were doing business with. Armstrong read the email standing in the middle of the hallway, cell phone in hand. Then he looked at Megan Campbell, and Megan said the name that needed to be said. Armstrong stood still for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Call her." If this story resonated with you, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because every week there's a new story that will keep you hooked from beginning to end. Emily learned about the call at 9 a.m. when Megan appeared at the back table and placed a cup of coffee next to her keyboard, silently reversing a years-old hierarchy. The call was at 2 p.m. in English, with 4 American executives and 2 lawyers from the buying group. Emily had 5 hours. She didn't panic. She opened the contract, reread each clause, mapped out the points of tension, prepared a line of argument, and mentally translated every technical term that might appear. At 1:50 p.m., she was in the meeting room on the 12th floor, wearing a blouse she had brought in her bag as if she knew from somewhere that this day would come. The call lasted 52 minutes. Emily spoke in English with precision and calmness, answering each question without hesitation, and at one point, when the American lawyer tried to press with an alternative interpretation of the clause that favored annulment, she cited from memory a comparative law contractual precedent that ended his argument before he finished formulating it. On the other side of the table, Armstrong stood still. He hadn't taken his eyes off her since the beginning of the call. And when the call ended, with the American group confirming the continuation of the agreement and requesting that she be formally included in the next steps, the silence in the room carried the weight of everything that had been ignored for 8 years. Armstrong asked everyone to leave the room. Everyone left. Emily remained seated, her hands on the table, waiting. He stood for a moment, looking out the window with that posture of a man internally rearranging a narrative that no longer fits together as it once did. Then he turned and said he wanted to understand why she had never said anything. About the contract, about what she knew, about the document management system he had discovered was hers, about everything. And Emily looked at him with a calmness that wasn't coldness, it was precision, and replied, "I did, several times, in different ways, to different people." No one asked back. Armstrong didn't answer immediately, because there was no answer that wasn't a confession. What happened in the following weeks wasn't a cinematic transformation with background music and applause. It was more uncomfortable than that. It was real. Armstrong called for a formal review of the job classification and discovered that Emily was receiving the salary of a senior administrative assistant, while in fact performing duties that crossed legal analysis, document risk management, and contract intelligence. The retroactive salary adjustment that HR calculated caused enough embarrassment that the CFO requested that the number not be circulated internally. Megan Campbell leaked the number internally, not by accident. Bobby Marshall was removed from the merger project on the same day the email containing the change history was formally filed in the internal dossier. He wasn't fired immediately. This type of company rarely acts with that speed when the person involved has been with the company for 10 years and is a patron on the board. But he was removed from all strategic meetings, had his access to the contract server suspended, and began to appear less and less in the corridors of the 12th floor. The people who used to follow him to meetings started arriving before him and choosing seats on the other side of the table. His power hadn't been destroyed by a decree. It had been emptied by the truth, which is always the most permanent form of destruction. The $100 million contract was signed 43 days later in a simple ceremony at Fortuna's headquarters. The American group sent 2 representatives. One of them, greeting Emily in the hallway before the event, said that her work had been explicitly mentioned in an internal meeting as the reason the deal had survived. She thanked him with 2 words and a firm handshake. Then she went into the bathroom, closed the door, and stood in front of the mirror for a time she couldn't measure. She wasn't crying. She was just letting the weight of 8 years finally find a place to settle. Emily Wilson took over as Director of Contractual Intelligence at Fortuna Capital 3 months later. It was a position that didn't exist before her. Armstrong created it because he realized there was no name on the organizational chart for what she did, and that the absence of that name had cost nearly $100 million. On the morning of her first day in the new role, she arrived at the office at her usual time, 8 o'clock. She walked through the glass corridors. This time, when her reflection appeared in the glass, she looked and recognized her. The desk at the end of the hallway sat empty for 2 days. No one knew for sure what to do with it. A new assistant even asked if it was available for her to sit down. HR said no, without explaining why, and this generated more rumors than any official announcement would have. Because within a company, strategic silence about an empty chair speaks louder than a promotion announced in a general meeting. People who for years had passed by that desk without looking at it began to look. And in the eyes of some there was something that Emily, when she found out, immediately recognized. It wasn't admiration. It was the belated discovery that they had been wrong, and that being wrong for so long about a person who was still there is a burden not to be carried lightly. On the day she finally moved up to the 12th floor, Megan Campbell was waiting for her with 2 coffees and the floor plan of the new office, where her name was already engraved on a small, discreet, brushed metal plaque next to the door. Emily went in. She put her bag on the chair. She looked out the window, which this time offered a direct view of the city, without any angle, without any obstacle. And then she did something no one expected. She opened her laptop, connected the external hard drive, and started working. There was no speech. There was no dramatic pause. There was only the sound of the keys and the white light of the New York afternoon streaming through the large window, falling on her shoulders with the generosity of things that arrive late but arrive right. Months later, in an internal interview that Fortuna's communications department conducted for the company's quarterly newsletter, Emily was asked what the most difficult moment of her career had been. She was silent for a few seconds. Then she said there wasn't any specific humiliation, no ignored project, no name mixed up in a presentation. The most difficult moment had been continuing to show up every day at a desk against the wall, knowing what she knew, and choosing to carefully guard that knowledge instead of letting the world decide whether it had value or not. "I didn't expect to be discovered," she said. "I was waiting for the right time." The interviewer wrote everything down. And when the newsletter came out, that last sentence was the only thing that circulated throughout the company, copied in emails, pasted on bulletin boards, repeated in meetings. Not because it was nice, because it was true in a way that hurts a little when you read it. If you've made it to the end of this story, you know this channel is for you. There's a new story every week. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us.